the basics of the activity and activity handler are going to be about the same as runner. So let's just go ahead and write that. Alright, so we've got the basics here. We've set up the activity to have distance, duration, and date, each of the right types. And we've written the activity handler to pull out the URL parameters distance and duration, create an activity, and put those in. But I didn't put in the date because instead of having the date be a URL parameter, what I want to do is just automatically put in today's date, just as a simplicity thing, instead of having someone having to enter it. So what I'll do is instead of pulling it out as a URL parameter, I'll just say run.date, and there's a way of extracting the today's date using a package called datetime. So we need to import datetime. Then we can go back over here, and we're going to, from the datetime, we're going to call the datetime package and call the now function. And now is going to return a datetime, which is a class that includes the date and the time. We don't want the date and the time, we only want the date. So from now, we're going to call date. That's a lot of stuff, and if you want to go Google that, you can easily find Python documentation that describes the date now package. But that does the essence of this. We haven't done one other important thing, which is we haven't put into the activity the runner's ID. So remember, for each activity, we wanted to say which runner that's associated with. In order to do that, we need to get the runner's ID. And in a real system, you would do this in a much more sophisticated way. But for now, what we'll do is we can just display on the web page the runner ID and let the user copy that and then paste into URL parameter when they're creating the activity the runner's ID. So to do that, what we need to do is going back to our runner and get the ID. Now, each model has a built-in method called key, and the key has a built-in method called ID, and that returns the ID number that we saw in the when we looked at the data store viewer. So let's add another colon. And since this is a number, we need to convert it to a string. And if we do this, and we go back and look at our viewer, and we reload this, now we can get that ID, which comes straight out of the data store. In fact, we can go look at the data store viewer and see that Ben Peterson's ID is 611-988 something. And sure enough, that's the right ID associated with me. So that works. So now let's go back to our activity handler and let the user put in a runner ID as well. Okay, I've updated the activity to do all that. We can now go ahead and just like we had a URL for adding a runner, let's go make a URL for adding an activity. So we'll add another tab, and I'm going to say localhost 8080 add activity. I'm going to be careful not to add a slash. I'm going to add a question mark. You can see I've done this before. Runner ID equals, and we'll go add a run for me. So I'll copy my runner ID, put it in here, and add some more URL parameters. Say my distance is 3 and my duration is 30, running 10 minutes a mile, say. Add that. We have an error, and let's use this as an opportunity to try and make sense of this. If we go here, something is clearly gone wrong here. Validate date. Alright, we're having trouble with our date. Property distance must be a float. Here we go. Main 53 and get distance equals distance. And my guess is, since, right, the URL parameters are always strings. Even though we entered a sequence of digits, URL parameters are always strings. Our model said that distance and duration were floats. So what we need to do is convert these into floats. Let's try reloading this. Maybe it worked. Let's go to our data store viewer, click back on the data store viewer, and now if we look on entity kinds, we'll see there's two, runner and activity. And the activity has the date, which is actually today's correct date, distance and duration, but no runner ID. And that's because, I bet, when we defined our activity, let's see, we set the runner ID. Because when we defined our activity model, we didn't define a runner ID field. And so we're going to put one in, make it a string property. That should fix that. I did notice another bug in our activity handler. Since I had sort of copied this code, I set activity as a run, but really this is an activity. So let's refactor this and rename it properly and call this an activity. There we go. That's much nicer looking code. Go back over here. Let's delete this bad activity and reload this one. Go back to our data store viewer and refresh. And now we have a distance, duration, and a correct runner ID. Excellent. Let's add some more activities. Maybe I had a long run and ran fast. Load that. And let's add another one. Just some kind of semi-random values. And let's add one or two for talk. So we'll take his ID and change this to use his ID. Let's assume talk is a really long distance runner. Go back to our data store viewer, refresh, and look, that worked. We've got 3 runner IDs of me, talk's ID. All right, our database is all set. The last thing that we need to do is go back to our main page that is currently only displaying our runners and do some more sophisticated queries so that we can display their activities as well.